This is an explanation of how I've created a canopic jar using the coiling hand building method. So canopic jars go back to the Egyptians, and they were essentially a vessel in which important organs were taken and out of the individual, put into them, and stored while they were mummified or what have you. And as you can see here in these images, I'm not really going for the idea of organs, it's just that the look of these objects is just so striking and it makes for a great format that can be toyed around with a little bit. So basically what you have is a tall jar with a lid that is a head of something else, whether that's a falcon or a jackal or a pharaoh or whatever else. It can be anything. You can use that as your stopper on the top. This also gives you that entire body, that jar portion of the canopic jar to incise anything that you'd like. So you see designs all over the place here and on these, some simple, some complex. It could be anything that you want. So I think this is a good way to work with the coiling process, learning how to build something up to a particular height. Usually I try to go to at least 12 inches. I think that's a good proportion for width to height with these. And then you can use this as a blank canvas, basically, and impose whatever idea you want onto it. So what I like about canopic jars, especially these ones that I found in this image off to the left-hand side, is how through the centuries, the surface of these things wears away, and you'll have the look of sandstone or rock underneath these once vibrant blues and greens. So that's the aesthetic that I want out of this. But I couldn't care less about these particular images here. I like to mess around with history a little bit, so I'm taking a toy form from 1989, this very sci-fi looking android pictured here. It's the housing for this character called Krang. And this is from my childhood. I just liked the form of this a lot. I thought it'd be interesting to mash this together with a canopic jar and make it look aged in some strange bastardization of history, as if this thing were seen by these people centuries ago and then created by them. So this is what I'm doing first, is gathering up my reference images, thinking about where I want to go with the idea, and then we begin. So underneath those paper towelings at the bottom, I have a banding wheel that I can rotate this on so I can see the front and the back relatively easily. I don't want to have to pick this whole piece up every single time I want to turn it, because I'll risk damaging it. And turn it I will be doing, because I want to make sure that I have a consistent look to all of the sides. So here I've started building up my jar, and you see how I'm doing that. I have the coils laid out. I'll usually roll out as many as I can really get on my limited table surface before I start applying them. Now with coiling, if you haven't done that before, it's a matter of slipping and scoring. Maybe if your clay is really wet, you don't have to slip so much, but for the most part, I'd recommend slipping and scoring to make sure you have a strong bond. As you coil these tubes, these snakes, around upwards, it's going to get taller and taller, but I would recommend, before long, smoothing out at least the inside of that jar. What that will do is cause all of this clay to lock together so it doesn't sit in separate stratified layers but as one solid wall. I also like to smooth out the outside. I don't particularly care for the look of a coiled vessel. It's just an overdone thing. So I'd rather have that as a blank surface on which to make my own designs. So that's where I've begun here. And you'll notice at the top I'm keeping some wet paper toweling so that as I'm smoothing out the body, that's not drying out too much. And up we go. Continuing to build, and here you see where I've been smoothing out the coils, checking my measurements, seeing where I'm at. If I want to get to a specific height or there's a requirement to get to a certain height, I want to make sure I'm checking frequently. continuing to build up. And now I have some paper toweling down at the bottom because this has been resting for a little while. The reason why is you want this lower section to get stiff. Not leather hard, but a little more advanced than what it would be in this plastic state of the new coils, because that's going to be the support system to hold up what you do at the top. However, especially at the very first part that I started out with, I don't want that getting overly dry. So I'm just wrapping that up with some moist paper toweling just to keep it protected. And up it goes, again, checking the measurement. And what you see in front here, this is a paddle. There's any number of types of paddles that you can use, but paddles are good for smoothing out the surface of your jar. So I'll rotate this around and around, and I'll paddle it as I go, making sure I'm compressing the sides. You're actually compressing the particles of clay against one another, lining them up consistently, and that's going to make for a much stronger wall in the end, and as you build. So I'm happy with the size of the body of the jar. Now I'm going to move on to the lid. I didn't even bother smoothing anything out with this lid. I just coiled it all the way up since it's relatively small, and then I smoothed it out afterwards. It looks a little bit like a beehive at this point. There it is, smooth. So after more refining to that, I want to go back to that body and make it perfectly the way that I want it to before I start decorating it. And what I have here is a series of tools, like these two things here are ribs. So a piece of metal with teeth on it. You see the teeth, the serrated edge of this. This one has even smaller teeth. And then this is actually a loop tool which I've modified with a file. I've taken some chunks out of that one side, so that basically like this, teeth as well, only larger. So first I go over the surface with this one, makes the deepest gouges, several directions, not just up and down, but side to side and diagonally. Then I move on to the next smaller size of tooth, go over it, and then finally I'll use that last one. You'll see that's getting it down to this nice consistent surface. I want this to be a sunken lid, where the lid part actually sits inside of the vessel, not on the outside of it. There's a couple different ways you can do lids. I want a sunken lid. So what I've done, now that I know what the profile was, I have this part of the head of the jar correct. I'm setting in from that just a little bit, building up my coils, working upside down to create this sunken area, the part that's going to keep it from just falling off the top. So there it is, being slid into place, and I've registered it. I'm looking at this line here and here. I know what I think is the front of both of them. In case it's a little bit off on one side or the other, I think that this is the best configuration. I've made a notation of that. And then I'm capping off that lid. I don't want this to be open underneath the lid. I want that solid. Again, slipping and scoring. And there it is. So it's inside now, and at this point we have essentially a blank canvas. This could go any number of directions from here. I know where I'm going with it, but you can imagine if you get to this point and it's setting up to a mid-leather hard state, you can go lots of different directions. You can make additions to it, plenty of subtractions to it. You can alter this head, you can alter this body. So that's where you want to get first, and then you can, I think, get onto the fun part, which is modifying it. So you saw what my reference was, and this is following those lines. I'm sketching things out with a needle tool on the surface so I can think it all through before I actually make any commitment to gouging into that surface. You can see here that I'm using a number of tools to gouge the surface and make those indentations that I want. And one thing to be aware of is how thick your walls are with your particular jar. You do not want to punch all the way through by gouging too deeply in any one area. Just be aware of that. I always think that it's helpful to pinch my fingers on the inside and the outside when I can and just feel in between my fingers how thick that seems to be. Don't let it get too thin, or otherwise you'll have to probably redo part of this. So it's progressing here. Still a little bit soft for fine details, so I'm leaving them roughed out. The back. At this point, I'm about ready to add attachments to the face. These 80s looking glasses in the nose, so I've scored that. Here they are roughed out on the face. And now that it's coming together and I more or less have the details the way that I'd like, I also need to make a little cockpit for that Krang brain that will sit inside of its belly. So I've cut this wall out here, and I've actually used that wall to make this concave area. So the wall is laying at the bottom, and then I've added a shallow wall with coils around the edge. And this is going to sit inside, and where you see this scored is actually going to be pulled against the edge on the inside that you can't see. And then when you look into this opening, instead of being right there in the jar, you're only seeing this reliquary, this indentation. And that's the way that it looks when it's attached. Now, there's a bit of an antenna on top of the head of this Android. So that's what I'm doing here, rolling out some small coils, using my loop tool to make an area for each of those parts to rest. Slipping and scoring, as always. And attaching everything together until it's the shape that I want it to be. And so I've attached that to the top of the head, and I've beveled off the sides to make it a little more angular. Refined everything on the head now. It's exactly the way that I want it to look. And so I put it into the body, into the jar, and everything is the way that I want it to look now. The only thing notably absent is that brain that should be in that center cavity. Now, before I did anything else here, because I'm moving on to the surface treatment next, I took a bit of plastic and I wrapped that around that antenna at the top. I don't want that to dry out too much. Anytime that you're working with clay, if you have a small, dainty detail, especially if that's much smaller than everything else, it's going to dry out quicker. More air exposure, less moisture to lose, so you want to protect that. So that's the deal with what I have going on at the top there, just for clarification. Now what I'm doing here is I'm starting to lay down layers of engobes and underglazes that will build up the complexity of the surface of this canopic jar. So first I'm starting out with a basic white engobe. So that's giving it this foggy appearance, as less reddish, covering it up. I'm not being particularly careful about it, just getting a loose coat down. You'll see why I'm not too finicky about this at this point. I'm covering over all of that light application of white engobe that I've already laid down. So here I'm starting with the second layer. This is also going to be underneath a third layer. This is a type of underglaze from Amico. It's blue-green V341. I think it's got a great color. It looks a bit like Egyptian paste, Egyptian faience, which in those early canopic jar images you saw that bluish green look. I'm trying to get that. So this looks like one of the values, or one of the hues rather, that's in that. So I'm applying that all over this entire piece. So you see that starting to take shape, just covering some areas, going over it until almost everything is colored in with that green, with that blue-green. And then over the top of that, I'm using Amico's teal blue underglaze V332. So that's going to be the top coat, and I'm going in with that rather thick. You see the complete green underneath, now the blue on the top. And if you look at this right-hand image here, it's totally blue. So that looks like something fresh off the assembly line. It almost appears plasticky right now. But I'm going to age this, I'm going to distress this, but before I get there, I needed to make sure that it was looking immaculate to begin with so that I can tear it apart, so I can destroy that surface. And here's how I do that. I'm taking a piece of medium or large grit steel wool, something coarse, and I'm scraping and gouging the entire surface. You see all of this powder that's forming here? That's the underglaze coming off of the surface with a bit of the clay as well. You want to be doing this in the advanced leather hard stage. You don't want this being soft clay. It will gunk up the steel wool very, very fast, and it's not going to make the mark that you quite want. So make sure that it's in the leather hard state, and also wear a dust mask when you're doing this. Don't be negligent with your health. If you breathe this stuff in, it's just never good news, regardless of whether it's non-toxic or what. Don't breathe in anything that isn't air, so wear a mask when you're doing this. It's just the best thing to do. And keep going along if you're trying to get a distressed look like this, and you'll see it's not just removing some of the blue and revealing the green, and some of the green and revealing the white, and some of the white revealing the stoneware underneath. You have all of these varying looks all over the place. You move your eyes around, you see different things happening. And it's gouging the surface of the clay itself, making this look as if it had been sand blown in the desert for a very, very long time. And so here in contrast, you see the lid is now finished, at least being sanded down, abraded, and then the body is still perfectly mint. So here you see the scouring pad and also the steel wool that I used to achieve that. But that's quite the contrast, and you go from having something look off the assembly line to very unique and old. Now, I chose to fire this piece entirely before I worked on that brain that's in the center. I wanted to maybe do something different with this. I changed my mind a couple of times, but I needed to move the rest of the project along. So here you see in the right-hand GIF that sculpture of the brain is being created step by step. And I have that left-hand image just to show you that I wrapped it in saran wrap just to keep the clay off of the finished fired sculpture, the rest of the jar, while I'm figuring out the size of this creature inside. But it's just a matter of refining however you hand build, whatever your sensibilities are, go with that and make any details like this that you need to. Now, like the rest of that body, I want to make sure that Krang looks the same, so I go over with that blue-green, and then over the blue-green with the teal-blue, and then I do the same exact thing that I did to the rest of it. Steel wool, scraping off chunks of that clay and the underglaze, and giving it a much more complex, vibrant surface. The last thing that I did was took that white engobe, could use a white underglaze as well, and I colored in his eyes so that they have a bit of a contrast, they stand out, as you see here. So he's high-fired as well at this point. The one detail I want to point out about this is the backside is gouged, thusly. Because what I need to have happen here is this to be glued inside of that cockpit chamber in the belly of the Canopic jar, and I want something for the glue, I use silicone, to grab onto. So that's just the back side of what you had just seen there. So here you see it's formed, it's underglazed, and then it's fired to cone 6. So Krang himself was fired a little bit higher. The rest of this is mid-range stoneware, so that's to cone 6, and that gives you all the color of the underglaze without that getting burnt out, but you get a warmth to that terracotta-based body underneath, and you can see more or less how that finished up. So here it is, combining a Canopic jar from ancient Egypt with an action figure from 1989 to now in 2016, the emergence of something that is a bit of the both of them. Try this out. I really think canopic jars are an interesting format. I do think of them as a format. Head as the lid, body as the jar, and you can put anything that you want on the surface to give it some kind of unique identity. And there you go, the Canopic jar.